Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. Today we are joined by investment banker Guy Hume as part of our Stoics in Business webinar series to discuss Stoicism and uncertainty in business. Feel free to type any questions, thoughts or comments through the Q&A or the chat function at any time. Many of you are already following the Foundation on social media and email newsletters, but if not, please check out our website, aureliusfoundation.com, and you can sign up to our mailing list and click through to our social media channels. I hope you enjoy today's discussion. Now over to Justin, founder of the Foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are in the world. We're having a beautiful spring day here in London. I'm delighted to host this webinar with a great friend of mine, Guy Hume, fellow Australian who's also based here in London. So we're going to talk a little bit about the last 12 months and the various things that we've seen in business and some of the changes that hopefully will come from the Stoic approach from the pandemic, but also some of the opportunities of learning and what we've seen for people to work through this very difficult period in business as well. So without further ado, just reminding everyone, the Foundation supports all things Stoic through the 4 virtues. We're very committed around opportunities to develop Stoic awareness in youth and character building programs there, which we've got some very interesting things forthcoming. And then this whole piece around, the Stoic mindset coming into more prominent position within the business community. And so on that basis, this conversation this afternoon is with Guy, which we're delighted to have. So Guy is from Melbourne and is head of financial sponsor coverage team for EMA at Nomura Bank. Previous roles at Deutsche Bank, UBS, Arthur Andersen, and with a real true global perspective. Guy's been in investment banking for a long time. He deals with a lot of transactions. He deals with a lot of different businesses, very complicated situations at times, and working a lot through equity capital markets and hedging and lending and merger and acquisition opportunities. I met Guy a number of years ago, and what struck me immediately in meeting my good friend here was his strong dedication and commitment for the greater good and doing things in a proper way, an honorable way in the business world. And we're very pleased that Guy decided to be a founding member of the Aurelius Foundation. So we look forward to this conversation this afternoon. And this was an image of Guy and I having a conversation quite a number of years ago. Well, actually last year, in fact, when we launched the Foundation event in London. So Guy, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. On that note, we wanted to start off with something that we saw.
Glad to be here, Justin. Thanks for inviting me.
We're delighted to have you. So last year, we saw a lot of things change. We had a dramatic impact of the COVID-19 restrictions on a global basis. The world had not seen that, certainly that type of effect and restrictions and lockdowns and a whole different view. And I was watching a program here, which I've listed earlier this week, of the effect, the positive effect on so many different parts of the natural world because of a lack of human movement in the last 12 months. And even some of the incredible things that have happened where we've had a reduction in CO2 emissions of 6%, the largest on record. You've seen animal species and animal migrations uninhibited, blue whales, birds, all sorts of really interesting turtles, all sorts of animals positively progressing and returning to their natural way because they haven't had to navigate through and around human beings. So, just as an overview, we want to talk about the business world. So in the last 12 months, the business world has had to react dramatically to, in some cases, for businesses to survive. There have been a smaller percentage of businesses that have been extremely successful because of COVID, for whatever reason, that the lockdowns have promoted their business and so forth. But as an overview, Guy, what would be your take of the last 12 months, just generally of what you've observed in terms of what businesses had to endure?
Thanks, Justin. Just give people context. I basically service private equity firms with banking products and services, principally advisory services, leverage lending, risk management products, actually, and that kind of thing. And our business is very much driven on transactions, companies investing, acquiring or selling companies to other funds, corporate carve-outs, public-private situations. And in the early part of the pandemic, that virtually stopped. As you can imagine, we're here today to talk about uncertainty. There was a lot of uncertainty, and the age-old human reaction, I think, to uncertainty is to just do nothing. And that initially was what happened. I think amongst my clients, the real challenge was trying to work out how they could preserve value, make sure, because again, uncertainty, nobody's crystal ball's any less opaque than someone else's, and what they really don't know is what the implications might be and how bad things could be for their performance of their companies. In a lot of cases, which are very levered. So they became very internally focused. They started to focus on things that are important to them, their own portfolio companies, management teams, that type of thing. And that went on for quite some time, actually. But actually, I'd say within 3 or 4 months, you saw markets actually stabilize. I think as it became apparent that this is really, it's not a financial crisis, was 2007, 8, 9. It's a humanitarian crisis with knock-on effects to the real economy. And once you saw that, there wasn't this huge amount of capital market value that just disappeared. The funds flow were there, and people got straight back on their front foot and really tried to start to deploy capital again. So that's on the sort of big picture macro side. From people and how they behave, I saw massively divergent reactions to 12 months from different people. Some people in the face of uncertainty just clam up, as I say, they sort of become internally focused, shut down, want to do very little, just worry about the sort of henny penny, sky is falling type reaction. The other reaction is you get people who really go on that bike. And that's the heart of what I wanted to talk to about today, and what I think is seems to be at the heart of Stoicism is this concept, which I think Epictetus really around focusing on those things that are within your control and trying not to let those things that aren't affect you.
Yeah, and I think, look, great overview, talking about the macro position in the market and the effect of everyone, because this time last year, the pandemic was in its first lockdown here in the UK, and we're going through an extreme situation. So, and then you have that effect that then drills down immediately into the individual reactions and how within businesses, how individuals and teams reacted. And this quote from Seneca is very powerful. If you would not have a man flinch when the crisis comes, train him before it comes. So the premeditation of worst outcomes is a Stoic trait of, sometimes people feel like it can be negative. I tend not to look at it that way. I tend to look at it from a business perspective. What is the worst that can happen? And in our lifetime, the two biggest things which have come in the last 15 plus years, 20 years, has been the financial crisis, which I'd love you to comment on. And then secondly, obviously the pandemic. And both businesses looking out into those events have had to react and take a view, and leaders in business have had to react and take a view. But I think from my own perspective in the businesses that I'm involved in, this time last year, we did take a Stoic view and say, what is the absolute worst situation that can unfold here? And let's work back from there. So would you say, Guy, talking about the 2008 and the pandemic, and then the businesses, and even from your own perspective of that Stoic view of how bad could it have been and what you were thinking and potentially this time last year?
Sure. I mean, the global financial crisis, as I alluded to earlier, and the pandemic, I mean, they're very different things, but I guess they're both black swan events, and neither of which were actually meditated or and sell, I guess. There had been in many ways the global financial crisis was more predictable, and I think there were definitely people out there who bet on it coming, and therefore employed this principle, and all better for them. I think in actual fact what happens is people react and regulators react, and what we find in this crisis is that there has been a lot of things change, certainly in the financial system, in regulation, approach to credit management and so forth, which mean that the impact of this now real economy slowdown for the period that we're talking about, and I think we're anticipating a massive recovery in short order, it would not have been as bad as it would have been if we hadn't had the global financial crisis. I think that's one thing in terms of meditating. I think there's just a lot of rigor put in place now that actually will have us helped, apart from obviously massive government assistance and self-help support, etc. I think the bulk of the benefit we're seeing is actually a reaction. In our own case, once this current pandemic, I think again people will react in the future. I think people they obviously recut their models as you would have done. Dial down, or to work out, okay, can we survive? Do we have sufficient liquidity to navigate the way through this, or are we going to have to take some other, sort of more severe action? And I do think going forward, again, I think businesses are going to do that. They're going to start as a discipline, put in place the once in a generation event, because those once in a generation events seem to come more regularly than they used to. And so, that's definitely a behaviour that'll come in. But look, I think the best thing in terms of apart from just anticipating and planning for outcomes, is actually putting things certain things that you can. Sorry, thank you. Just getting good service here with a cup of tea. See me through discussion, Justin. I think it's there's things like I always say that almost everything that happens to you in life is a function of who you surround yourself with. So if you've got really good people, that's something that if and when you really need to support them, they're there, and you're going to be talking in the moment about flexibility. Have that ability to adapt, and so I think through the pandemic and the implications of it, I feel that a lot of people reacted as opposed to anticipated, and that going forward, we're going to get a lot more of this premeditation type approach in business.
There's a comment here which Neil has sent in and said, often people think practicing premeditation malorum is being pessimistic about things. And I'm taking Neil's sentiment here, and I, in fact, agree. I think, and you just mentioned that the guy, I think going forward, once or twice a year, certainly once, or certainly around major planning periods, I think businesses and leaders will be taking a view, okay, if we got a black swan event this year and we had to shut down, I think this stoic outlook of preparing for the worst of outcomes is going to be part of business planning going forward. And it needs to be, because as you mentioned, there's been a global financial crisis which looked into one void, and then this has come up 10 plus years later, and this was catastrophic for many businesses, and it was catastrophic for many businesses. Some, the amount of businesses that didn't survive this, and we're still, even though the world is opening up, we're still not coming out. It's still not completely out of the woods yet. So let's moving on then, talking about flexibility, and this Seneca quote: "We must also make ourselves flexible to avoid becoming too devoted to the plans we have formed." I think this is, again, a very powerful point of Stoic understanding, that to be fluid, to be flexible. And over the last 12 months, you've seen a lot of different businesses. How would you talk about the flexibility and the ability to adapt to change that you've seen from your perspective? Because you would have seen it from the structural side of supporting businesses, but also interacting with management teams.
Yeah, absolutely. Ability to adapt, and not just in a singular way, but in a fluid and continual way, has been the hallmark of parties that have endured, parties have been challenged by the pandemic and the impact on the real economy. I mean, there's obviously been parties that have been massively positively affected. So we're talking about those people and those organisations which had a negative impact here. Obviously, there's the flexibility around bringing forward initiatives which you've been meaning to do, or developing, be it software, tech, healthcare, supply chains, efficiency, whatever it is. That flexibility, to accelerate those sorts of things, and or create new and things that then will actually and as I say, accelerate development. That's been a hallmark as well, and we've seen that a lot with companies that are basically, out of this, they're going to be a lot sort of leaner. Their work practices, which everyone was developing sort of remote, there was some form of ability to work remotely, but that's really accelerated massively. And I think now the flexibility of people's working hours, where they work from, and therefore, just their cost structures. I mean, the operational leverage that's in a lot of businesses today as we come out of this is phenomenal, and it's come from the mother of all invention. We've seen a lot of that certainly with clients. With people, it's different. I mean, as I said earlier, I work in a professional services organization. That just means it's largely a bunch of people, and people are handle these sort of situations differently. Some people really struggle not having a routine of sort of going to an office, putting themselves in a spot, and just focusing in that way. They get distracted. So there's been some of that, but generally on the whole, I found that people needed flexibility. They've sort of embraced. I've actually felt, on my 8 to 10 Zoom or WebEx calls every day, there's a real empathy for people to help others to through things, just inquire as to how people are going and how they can help and so forth. It's been quite remarkable to see in a very sort of mercenary and clinical environment that I work in.
Yeah, I think, and there's a comment here that David has sent through, which I appreciate greatly. He says, someone a lot smarter than me said something like, plans are worthless, but planning is everything. It allows us to identify areas of weakness, alternative paths to action, and key lines of communication. David's, thank you for sending that through, which really does tie into Seneca's message here. And in business, the world that we're in, with the endless drive to 24/7, digitalization process and activity, then it becomes even more important to keep, a calm handle on the rudder and to be extremely flexible. I know in the businesses and the peoples and the teams that I'm working around with me, we're trying to stay very nimble. We're trying to, yes, we have good plans, but after last year and what occurred, we're quite open to what will happen next week and how do we need to act, and therefore what do we need to do. Now, one of the other things, Guy, here, which you touched on, I think, which is the sharper edge of business in some respects. Before the pandemic, businesses in different ways are all going along. The pandemic did take to business in certain ways, where certain businesses that have been going on for a long period of time and struggling were cleaned out. Nature had a resolving period, and the pandemic pushed that ahead. Then new innovation came in and digitalization accelerated. But then also, and having been there as well, some tough decisions had to be made, for the greater good. And what I mean by that, the greater good of that business, where many businesses had to realign cost base because that was required for the business to continue to exist. Now, when we make those decisions and we're thinking about them, and your world is a pretty tough world at times, some of those decisions are made because we have to save 90% of our jobs because we have families and kids and education and so forth. So we did our best to carry as many people as possible. But there were some times where we had to make some decisions, and I think that is across the business sector. But I view that as a practicing Stoic, that the greater good was served through flexibility, but certain decisions had to be made, and they were difficult ones. But for the greater good of those people, those families, those jobs to protect, we had to make those decisions. And I think you're in a world where you probably see that, and you've seen it a lot in the last 12 months. Going forward,
no, absolutely. Like that David put through the simpler version of. I was going to say simpler version of what David sent through. My brother used to always quote, which is, "Failing to plan is akin to planning to fail." And yeah, but I do think that, as I say, it's a dynamic process, something you need to continually revisit and go through. Responding to what you just said, Justin, I mean, there have definitely been many instances over the last 12 months, and even it's topical right now. My firm has a 31 March year end, so we're coming through our comp round. You're going to talk about a certain unfortunate event in the UK. On another slide in a moment, there's a very large one of losses recorded in the US, which unfortunately we're involved in, Archegos, and that's going to have an effect on people's expectation, on their overall comp versus expectations. And I think it's for me. I'm thinking about it, and I've got John Seller's book here. I'm always plugging his book, Lessons in Stoicism, because chapter 2 for me is just sums up so many of the principles by which I can help myself both navigate through some of these sorts of challenges, but also pass on to the people that I'm making tough decisions around, that you're like you say. Chapter 2, which is what do you control, and talking about not saying probably purely only your judgments. So if you had a certain premeditated judgment about a certain outcome that doesn't happen, then you're going to be unhappy. Whereas if you just focus on playing the best role that you can within the scenario that you see, you ultimately can find some solace and comfort.
Yeah. No, exactly. And I think building on that, if we go to a discussion on resilience, and using this quote from Marcus himself, to be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over, it stands unmoved and the raging of the sea falls still around it. And I think in the last 12 months, any sort of leadership position, in whether business or government or different aspects of society, has had to work through this particular point to stand firm in the face of adversity. Now, one of the things which is important, which again, being a practicing Stoic, is that Stoics get a bad rap sometimes, that people think that Stoics just roll over, they accept things, they subdue their emotions, and they just endure. It's not the case. And I think Marcus Aurelius, as the Roman emperor, and is universally accepted in the top 5, if not the top 3 greatest emperors. You don't hold that position for very long unless you were a great leader, because they were all out for you. And he had to make certain decisions at the time to defend the political interests of the empire, same as a business leader will protect the interests of that organization, or a university president or a government official has to make and has to stand firm. And if they feel like they're standing on the right principles, then those decisions can be a lot easier to make. And in the face of headwinds, someone can stand there. So the resilience of leadership over this period, particularly in the business world. You've seen really good cases, and you've mentioned a little bit, you saw people wavering a little bit, but your thoughts around resilience over this period, Guy? You've touched on the BIS already, but anything you'd add to this, that ability to stand in the middle of headwinds when it's all going pear-shaped? You know, I think the Stoics do a great job of it.
Yeah, absolutely. But some of resilience is kind of nature, and some of it, I guess, is nurture. It comes from your own experiences. And actually, you know, running a reasonable sized team of people of diverse backgrounds and of a wide span of ages, it struck me within the first couple of months of the pandemic that all organizations had to do what they could to support the mindset, you know, the mental well-being of their people, because, you know, most of the guys in my team hadn't experienced a crisis before. You know, when the global financial crisis happened, they were midway through high school, and they really didn't know what it meant. And you know, nobody was proactively going out there and sort of answering questions or you know, giving them the opportunity to ask questions and provide the benefit of their own experience. And so I actually set up a webinar not dissimilar to this with a colleague of mine, Guy Haywood Cole, and we called it a conversation. And it was basically giving, you know, because he's been through the tech bubble, myself through the Asian currency crisis meltdown. You know, you had the you know, global financial crisis. We obviously had some trouble in 2016 around oil price, and now you've had this pandemic. And you know, just being able to talk to people, you know, compare and contrast, you know, the similarities and differences. You know, what happened in the aftermath of those various crises. You know, just puts into people's head that, you know, the sun comes up tomorrow, and you know, there will be a way through. And you know, all questions around you know, your job tenure and or other things that you know, where you are hoping to be, become somewhat alleviated. I found.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then if we think about the difficulty of the pandemic and its blunt trauma, and then there was the endurance period of just working through all the lockdowns. And I'm only speaking from our perspective because there's people on this call that are still in lockdown around the world. We are slowly but surely making some positive moves here on the back of a vaccine tailwind, which the UK government has done an excellent job. So, but then, you know, you start to, that's why I think also with either the back end of the pandemic lockdown period, and then as we start to move out, Tim LeBon says this best, that, you know, Stoics are, we've done some various surveying, Stoics can be very zestful, and they don't get the credit for that. And these quotes here from Seneca are brilliant in reflecting that. The mind that is anxious about future events is miserable. So you're being challenged to move beyond those negative emotions, but the whole future relies in uncertainty, so live immediately. So, you know, you take these quotes and you start to think about the future. So the pandemic has reset everyone almost to ground zero in so many different ways. I know some of the businesses I'm in, I'm reset to ground zero. We were charging before the pandemic. We were, you know, had to survive the pandemic. And now we start from a lower profitability with a stronger team. And we look to the future much more confidently because there is a silver lining that we can reshape ourselves confidently, you know, from the effects of the pandemic. So we think about it on that front. I again think that you're a very optimistic individual. How do you view going forward here around business, around the economic outlooks for the foreseeable future from your Stoic lens?
Look, I am pretty upbeat about the near term. You know, I would say the next half a year, 3 quarters, you know, 12 months. I think for a couple of reasons. You know, as I said earlier, this is purely from a sort of business macro perspective. Now, you know, this is a human crisis, humanitarian crisis. You know, in terms of actual capital markets, funds flows, it's still extraordinarily strong. And so, you know, I think also if you look at record equity prices, you know, in markets, I think there is a motivation for people to buy and sell when it comes to, you know, corporate transactions, M&A, and so forth. And so we've seen that obviously, and you know, if you look in the revision mirror of a similar sort of period, I think we can, absent some other black swan event, that perhaps we should be premeditating at this time, and whether that's a completely resilient virus or something like that, I don't know. But based on what we know today, I think there's actually a really strong opportunity, you know, from a capital markets and corporate finance perspective. Equally, however, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of affected companies, and I think as government assistance rolls back and the dust settles, those companies and sectors which have managed to get through, but are essentially now loaded up with incremental debt from deferred taxation and those kinds of things, they need to be recapitalized. You know, and that work, on the other hand, is going to create a huge opportunity for investment, and equally, you know, the sort of restructuring and financial advisory, accounting firms, and so forth are going to be, and lawyers. Lawyers are always busy, right? But you know, I just think there's going to be an unbelievable amount of actual activity, you know, from a financial markets and banking perspective. On the economy, really can't say. I mean, everything you read about, you know, the outlook for the US, it's only in one direction. It's just a matter of which degree of, you know, you know, sort of ascent you factor in. But it is going to come back very large. There's a very significant amount of pent up private capital seeking to be spent, really. And then in Europe, it's much more nuanced and complicated, I guess. But certainly, I'm really invigorated. You know, I'm a massive believer that change equals opportunity. Right? Change is the only constant in life, and change equals opportunity for some. And so I think that's how I view it.
Yeah, there's a question here from my good friend Phil Yanov, who's in New York, I believe, or in the States certainly. But he asked the question here, which I think, Guy, we can take on the next slide. He asked, how do you think your Stoicism is influencing your current decision making? So, Phil, let's address that question on this slide, and it'll come through at the end, Phil. So, Guy, thanks for those insights. What we wanted to do, we've only got a few minutes left, but we wanted to share with the audience using Stoic thinking in reviewing situations in business, but also reflecting on how people get into situations. And it's my belief that if we had more leaders in business, government, with Stoic training or a Stoic outlook or just Stoic awareness, we would avoid a lot of problems. So this particular incident we want to highlight today, it's all over the press in the UK. It's somewhat of a, it's got global review, and I'm reading articles even in the Washington Post about it, where basically you've got a fellow Australian, and we're not judging here, we're just saying what we know, and we're putting a Stoic lens over it. We have a former banker who had an idea to help supply funding finance and bring that into the UK government during the Cameron premiership. And it's gone, it was a program to facilitate better cash flow management. And this company made money, people got paid faster, for lack of a better term, and it was supposed to go through in a very efficient way. It was implemented in certain parts of the government. Anyway, this company then got into financial trouble because of the pandemic. And then the former prime minister started working for this company, and then it got even more tricky that the former prime minister was reaching out to help support this company. So there's quite a bit to digest there, but the overview, which comes back to Phil's question, how I would approach this and how current thinking in Stoic thought, I try and attempt to take my Stoic lens into all decision making, particularly decisions that are quite significant. So if you cast the four values over this, the Stoic cardinal virtues, and you say, well, was it a wise program that they were trying to implement? And I think, Guy, yours and from my perspective, I use supplier funding and finance support in my cash flow management, and it's a great system. You know, it can work really well for everyone. It can get funds quicker to suppliers. There's a small cost to it, but everyone, and it can move goods and services quite quickly. So in my mind, it's a major tick, and from what the intention was. Now, in terms of temperance, which you might say is moderation, is how they put the program in originally. You know, it seemed to go, you know, and again, just from the press perspective, it seemed to be pushed through instead of bringing people on. The civil servants that were involved in implementing this program potentially didn't understand it as well. And that put pressure on the whole scope of it, and people felt like they were being ramrodded almost in terms of the program. Now we start to get a little bit possibly negative on it. Was it a just program? Well, in its intent it was, but I would come back and say, well, justice, what is that? Fairness. And I think this is the core heart of this particular problem. Why it would come under scrutiny from a justice and fairness standpoint is that the program never went to tender. And I'll ask Guy to comment on that point in a moment. In the banking world, or in any good governance world, in the business world, major projects, but particularly in government, that have millions and millions of pounds at stake for the public greater good, for Stoic greater good thinking, these programs should always go to tender so that the public's money is protected and the best programs think. Now, that is where I think this particular issue really fell over. And then at the end of the day, what decisions were being made, and were those courageous decisions to do the right thing? In other words, could these guys have done a tender process for their program? They would have had the inside track anyway, because they were inside the house. They could have won it justly, and it could have went ahead. And that would have been in terms of the original premise for this program. So the courage to do that, for whatever reason, was not followed through from a business perspective. But Guy, your comments around this issue, I know you've been watching it as well, your comments around governance for the greater good, just your lens over it from a Stoic perspective, but also from a business perspective, and blending them both together.
Look, just very briefly, I think, first of all, very lucky or pleased not to be a part of it. It does have lots of hallmarks of, jobs for the boys. And I think that's from David Cameron's perspective, that's the most difficult piece. I'm not sure he entirely understood what he was being part of. That when it comes to wisdom, like look at it from his perspective, I think lack of wisdom there. I think he didn't properly understand that, these are fine, it's trade finance, but how does the business finance itself? And when you get a situation like if we found ourselves in now, and that funding disappears, then the whole thing unravels, and you get situations like this. I think the other thing is that I'm not sure it was necessarily thought through. I totally agree with you that it's a very legitimate liquidity product, and that sort of credit is at the lifeblood of trade. But when you're talking about government and budgets, spending of budget, and it's almost a lockbox of economics. And certainly, if someone's making a profit, even if it's a tiny profit of a small margin, it's leakage, right? It goes out, and that brings you under huge amounts of scrutiny, and therefore, protocol and the actual governance here requires tenders to be done. Why that was compromised, is yet to be seen. But very, very poor amount of judgment here. And again, in terms of the things that you can control, judgments is considered by Stoics to be the one thing that is truly within your control.
Yeah, and I think there's two aspects of this issue. There's the actual programs that were put forward to the government, how they got through the system without that type of governance. And then secondly, the influence that a former prime minister can put on the government to try and establish funding for a business outside of the process and everyone else had to go in. Now, ultimately, that didn't work. So there's two separate issues going on here. But it's very interesting that you see, major leaders, falling over on the four virtues, and now they come under tremendous scrutiny and tremendous pressure to account for themselves. And former Prime Minister Cameron is in the hot seat right now, trying to justify his position. So one of the things, coming back to Phil's question, is I think if we had more education, more awareness, more focus of business leaders in particular, because business leaders control a lot of different things and interactions, if they were more trained around Stoic thought and keeping the four values close to themselves and those Stoic virtues, a lot of difficult decisions could be avoided because they're making better decisions on a consistent basis, along wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. Guy, this is more of a personal question to you, talking about, we've got just a couple more minutes and we're going to close. We've got a great question from Greg here, talking about the pandemic and the effect on the poor and how would the Stoics approach that, but we're going to have to deal with that one separately. But Guy, more just a question to you during the last periods and how you've dealt with the pandemic, working from the inner citadel with your Stoic attitudes, your own character. These quotes are always super powerful. We know them, but how would you say that you've worked from your own position within your own family, your own interaction with your teams, and how you've dealt with the pandemic in a few sentences, and some of the learnings you've taken from that?
Look, I think this harks back to something you and I discussed at that inaugural Aurelius Foundation meeting, where I felt like I might be a Stoic and I just didn't know it, because a lot of what you've made me aware of, and I've become enlightened around on the Stoic philosophy, I expressly thought of and would articulate all through my formative years. I mean, I'm no stranger to adversity. I told you that my father's been a blind man since birth, and when you grow up as a young child with somebody who's got a strong disability like that, you watch it, and I told you my story about him first telling me to adapt and overcome, and it's something I have always tried to do. My mother died when contracted cancer and died when I was not even a teenager, and then I had to make some decisions for myself and really go on and develop resilience. And it came from, as I say, I always used to say, I'm trying to focus on those things that are within my control and not let those things that I can't affect me negatively. I think, so in this pandemic, I think commercial judgment, is within your control. The amount of effort that you put in is within your control. Again, who you surround yourself with, good people that are additive to your day, not people who want something from you, take advantage of you. All of those sorts of elements are within your control. And I think if you just, are thoughtful and exercise good judgment, it just helps you get through.
Terrific. Guy, thanks so much for those, again, that very personal sharing of your background. I think is very inspiring to me, and the way that you've got yourself to a fantastic position in life. Great family guy, great career, and someone who's always thinking about others and trying to contribute in any situation to the greater good, whether it's on a personal basis or professionally. I think if Guy and I discuss these things for takeaways, 4 takeaways from this particular webinar, we're about to wrap up. As business people, we want to be as efficient and on time as possible. But just very quickly, Stoic philosophy should not stop when someone enters into the business arena or the boardroom. And Guy and I try to do that every day that we're interacting with people. Number 2, predicting, forecasting, planning through Stoic awareness is crucial. That, we've touched on the fact that you got to plan for what could be a black swan event now. And you need to have that on your planning agenda. Number 3, business leaders and managers would be best served to keep a Stoic view lens close by when making their decisions to withstand ethical scrutiny. I think that's crucially important. Even in the last 24 hours, totally separate issue, but we saw the English Premier League try to be hijacked into a situation that was counter to the greater good. And boy, did they get the reaction. Now, you would wonder up front if Stoics, if they would have had that awareness, would they have even attempted that type of approach? But clearly that was a monetary issue underpinning that versus the greater good. And then finally, business is not separate from nature. So ESG, which we didn't touch on as much in this presentation, but will again, environmental social governance strategies are now more important than ever for protecting the environment, protecting supply chains, protecting employees, and businesses being great corporate citizens as they interact with the wider business world. So, Guy, thank you so much for being with us. This is we just decided together that this would be a great show to watch. That you can see the lack of business over the last, and the lack of human movement over the last 12 months has been remarkable to the greater good of the environment. And I would highly encourage Stoics to look at this and temper themselves. I know that I've thought about my carbon footprint movement over the last 12 months and will continue to do so. And then finally, a separate plug for this weekend, Sunday. You'll be happy to know this is the 1900th birthday of Marcus Aurelius, and Modern Stoicism is conducting a great event on Sunday for about 3.5 hours. We at the foundation are sponsoring the event, and we'll have a small participation at the end with 2 young ladies giving their perspectives on Stoic philosophy and how they use it. But Christopher Gill, John Sellers, Donald Robertson, it's a great lineup for this weekend to celebrate Marcus's 1900th birthday. So, Guy, closing comment from you, but thanks so much for your time this afternoon. Fantastic. I'll leave you to close anything you'd like to close out on.
Onwards and upwards always, I like to say.
Terrific. All right, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Guy, for a thing. We look forward to, we've got some webinars coming up, and we have an announcement coming soon for our first in-person event in London, which looks like be in September, but we will update everyone once that date is confirmed. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Ciao.